The government says it remains in touch with all key stakeholders in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. That's after the International Criminal Court issued a warrant of arrest for Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's over war crimes. Putin is expected to join his BRICS partners in South Africa for a summit in August, with the potential to create a similar incident that took place in 2015 when the government failed to arrest Omar al-Bashir. So how will South Africa handle this diplomatic challenge? Well, let's speak to international relations expert Professor Siphamandla Zondi. Professor, good morning and thank you very much for your time. You know, the ICC warrant of arrest featured prominently in the news cycle, even in the midst of a shutdown. I mean, even on Sunday, when government was seized with shutdown preparations, some journalists asked the presidency spokesperson if the President Putin would be arrested on arrival. And he answered very interestingly. It was an interesting and confusing manner. He merely reiterated their position to encourage dialogue between the two nations. So he said a lot without saying much. Your take on everything that's happening currently?
Yes, this arrest warrant does create an awkward situation, an al-Bashir kind of situation for South Africa with the BRICS summit scheduled to take place later in the year. And President Vladimir Putin expected to attend that, and likely to be a physical meeting or maybe converted to a virtual meeting for this reason. But it does create a bit of a difficulty for South Africa as a member of the ICC. It perhaps reinforces the view that was pushed after al-Bashir for South Africa to withdraw from the ICC or to change the domestication law of the ICC to ensure that whatever obligations are under the ICC, they exempt sitting president simply because, as other countries do, that helps to prevent a huge difficulty. The former president of Russia has already indicated, almost intimated, that, like the Americans said earlier, that the Hague will become a military target for them. The Americans said that 4 years ago, and then the Russians are now saying the same thing. That don't touch our, like the Americans say. So it's a serious problem for the ICC. It is very small, it has no enforcement power. It depends on member states to enforce it. And South Africa now is expected to enforce this in relation to this ICC warrant. And it has not enforced one warrant before. A few countries have also not enforced similar warrants before.
Now, touching on the USA, many were thinking they were probably going to find it a bit difficult to react to the arrest warrant because they themselves are not signatories. People would be reminded in that moment, China as well, which is a close ally of Russia, the Ukraine, as well as Russia itself. So it's quite interesting that eventually we saw President Biden adding his voice and actually saying that warrant was justified, because many had thought he'd really keep mum on just this matter because he'd be reminded that perhaps he needs to support it more and be a signatory.
Yes, the Chinese have come out and said what is needed is to exempt heads of states in all of that. That's with their historical positions and all that. The Americans have said nothing because they have threatened the Hague themselves over the arrest, not of politicians, not of heads of state, but even of a mere soldier and all of that. It is the Germans, the French, and the Netherlands that have spoken on this and showed support for this, of course, Ukraine as well. That is out of a coalition of about 50 countries. Only 3 countries have said up in the open what they are going to do. It just goes to show how difficult this matter is going to be. Arresting Putin will not be an easy thing. It could trigger something bigger. And we will be assured that Russians are going to respond to whoever does anything to Putin. We know it will. So it's very tricky. Everybody knows that it's not just al-Bashir who not only just in power, but is weakened in power. This one is the president of a superpower, huge military, nuclear power, quite popular in Russia. About 70% of the Russians back him up in recent polls. So it's not an easy matter. It's not some. That is why even the big and powerful are kind of mum about it, hoping that we just keep it and use it for propaganda purposes, use it for pressure purposes, use it for defaming purposes and stuff like that, but not really to actually effect it. I doubt there will be an arrest of Putin anywhere until it's severely weakened internally.
I want us to tackle President Putin's global profile. But before that, I still want to take you back to our dualist position of fence sitting, if you will, because here it's essentially being tested, like you say, similar to in 2015, where it was our AU obligations versus our ICC obligations with the Omar al-Bashir matter. And this time, it's our BRICS obligations versus the ICC. It sounds to me like you're saying that possibly South Africa would see this as another opportunity to attempt to withdraw from the ICC.
I think so. I think it would. If South Africa is unable to meet its obligations under the ICC in certain cases that are difficult, such as these two, it would make sense for it to rather seek a withdrawal and join the over 150 other countries that are not members of the ICC, over 160 other countries that are not members of the ICC, and a few that are pulling out. But the ICC could also help to prevent this massive withdrawal by ensuring that you don't use this deliberately to create awkward situations for countries. But clearly the situation in Ukraine, that triggered by the invasion of Ukraine, will not be solved by this arrest, will not be solved by sanctions, will not be solved even by arming Ukraine. Will ultimately, like all wars, be solved on a negotiation table through a negotiation that addresses the concerns from all sides.
Now, Professor, our withdrawal.
There's no military victory in the past 20 years. You can name it. It doesn't happen. There is no military victory.
And then now our withdrawal back in 2016, if I remember correctly, the courts ruled was unconstitutional. The matter was brought by a number of legal organizations or human rights groups that brought the matter. But it was purely on the procedure taken, where the Justice Ministry here did it unilaterally. It wasn't brought before Parliament to be dissected. So you believe that this time around, given that the only reason for that judgment was the lack of procedure or the circumventing of processes, do you think that this time around, if they attempted, it would possibly go through?
I know for a fact that there will be, if South Africa invites Putin to South Africa, there will definitely be an attempt to take this to court again over the matter of obligations. That are obligations under the treaty, and will be supported by a whole group of other people, but it will still be opposed by a whole group of other people. South Africans are very divided on this issue. They were divided on al-Bashir too, but the courts will be forced to enter this terrain and try and resolve what politicians don't really resolve. What would be ideal is for the things to be resolved well ahead of time. One way of resolving it is to have Putin visit electronically and convert the meeting to a virtual meeting, because that then would avoid all sorts of other things, so that the BRICS can then proceed without trouble. Failing which could be the amendment of the Act by which we domesticate the ICC treaty like other countries and add a provision for immunity for sitting out of states if they wish to do so, if they can get the votes in Parliament. My suspicion that they can get the votes in Parliament. I know that the A will oppose this very strongly, but I don't know whether the EFF would oppose it. I don't know whether UDM and other parties would do. On this matter, we do get divided on an ideological line, the right and the left. will take very different positions.
Now, Professor, just before I let you go, I just want to get your views around China. I mean, it's a BRICS member, remains a strong ally of Russia, and Xi Jinping is actually visiting Russia this week. It seems China is looking to position itself, we could be wrong, position itself as some sort of a peace broker now. It has aspirations of being a global player, similar to USA. It has the economic might, but very little influence on a global stage. What do you make of this attempt of theirs to broker peace between Russia and the Ukraine now?
It is not new. Their very first response in February of 2022 was that this issue must be resolved peacefully. It was that the war was not the way. Told Russia, too, that the war was not the way. That the best way is to negotiate. It is a civilized way of resolving issues and stuff like that. Of course, it was not listened to by the Russians. Neither was it listened to by the other warmongers led by the United States, the EU, and others who believe also the solution must be a counter war. So they've been consistent in this pushing for a peaceful resolution, but it's also part of their founding principles in international relations. To support peaceful resolution of things and never support wars.
But some in the West are criticizing them. Some in the West are saying, apologies for interjecting there, but some in the West think that this is perhaps part of a bigger plan, that they're going to convince the Ukraine to drop their guard, and then 5 months later, President Putin would probably attack them when they least expect it. That's what the US have been saying, that this is all a ploy. China remains an ally of Russia, and they cannot assist in brokering peace between these two.
We would believe that if we are naive, because if we were not naive, we would know what is the Western position on the situation, is that there must be military victory. What does military victory mean? It means arms, more killing, more destroying of infrastructure. So very similar to Russia. Their position are very similar to Russia. That is why they'll be uncomfortable with a different way, which is a negotiated settlement. They've never been comfortable with a negotiated settlement. They don't like negotiated settlements. It's very strange that countries that call themselves leaders of the civilization believe in war, the most uncivilized way, as the way to do that, and to live in hegemony and counter-hegemony. Those ideas we in the Global South don't identify with. In some ways, Russia and them are very similar in that regard, and we're very different in the fact that we think war is a more civilized, negotiation a more civilized way of doing it, and that the track record that we've had. Of course, the Chinese and the Americans have their own rivalry, and then they take over this. They take very different positions, and it to be believed. The Americans believe that no one should mediate, but Americans must mediate, and they believe that if somebody mediates, they may kind of get some sort of advantage. They're trying to replace them, which is understandable. They've been dominant in the world, and they feel that dominance is being clear. But definitely, the Chinese are consistent in doing. Whether they're doing for the right reason, we don't know. But they're consistent in calling for negotiated settlements, just as over 150 other countries believe this must be resolved through peace, because there's their historical positions, even in the Cold War, that peace was the best way to development, not war.
Professor Zondi, thank you very much for your insights this morning. That was international expert Professor Siphamandla Zondi.